What if the story of human civilization isn't the neat timeline you were taught in school? We're told that humans went from hunters and gatherers to farmers to builders of cities step by step in a slow, steady climb. But what if that story is only half true, or maybe not true at all? Imagine that everything we consider modern, from towering architecture to global trade, was once the achievement of a civilization so old it's been erased from memory. Imagine that the first civilization didn't just vanish, but quietly set the foundation for the world we live in today. It sounds like the beginning of a science fiction story, but people have been whispering about this idea for centuries. Ancient philosophers wrote about it. Modern researchers have debated it. Fringe theorists and conspiracy hunters have shouted it from the rooftops. The question is always the same. What if the civilizations we call the first weren't actually the first at all? What if history as we know it is just the surface layer of something far deeper? Think about how fragile evidence really is. If our own world were to collapse tomorrow, if cities emptied, lights went out, and technology stopped, what would survive 10,000 years from now? Buildings would crumble, cars would rust, plastic might linger, but scattered and unrecognizable. Forests and deserts would reclaim what humans once built. Even our massive skyscrapers, the symbols of modern achievement, would eventually fall. Within a few thousand years, nature would erase most of it. Now imagine stretching that timescale not by thousands, but by tens of thousands, or even millions of years. How much would be left? Maybe nothing we could easily recognize. That's the heart of this mystery. If there really was a first civilization, how would we even know? The evidence might already be gone, or it might be right in front of us, disguised as myth, mystery, or anomaly. Across the world, human cultures carry stories that sound strangely similar. Floods that wiped out entire peoples, gods or strangers who came bearing knowledge, golden ages that collapsed into darkness. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from ancient Egypt to the Pacific Islands, the same kinds of tales echo across time. Are these just coincidences? Or do they reflect memories passed down from a civilization that once existed but no longer has a name? And it isn't just myths. Over the last century, archaeologists have uncovered sites that challenge the neat timelines of history. Places that shouldn't exist at the time they were built. Monuments and cities constructed with techniques that seem far too advanced for the so-called primitive cultures that supposedly built them. Whenever these discoveries surface, debates follow. Some experts dismiss them as misinterpretations. Others quietly admit that history may be older and stranger than we've ever realized. But this mystery doesn't only live in ruins and legends, it also hides in the gaps of our knowledge. Scientists know that massive cataclysms have struck Earth throughout its history: volcanic winters, asteroid impacts, floods, sudden climate shifts. Any one of those could have destroyed not only life, but also the memory of any advanced society. If humans disappeared today, would future beings even know we existed? Or would our traces look like strange blips in geological records, nothing more than anomalies in the rocks? This is where speculation starts to turn into obsession. Some people believe that the story of our world has been deliberately rewritten, that records of a first civilization exist, but have been hidden or destroyed to maintain the narrative of human progress. Others believe that governments or secret societies already know the truth, but conceal it because it would rewrite history, and with it, power itself. Skeptics argue, of course, that these are fantasies, that human civilization is young and fragile, and that there simply wasn't time for anything advanced to exist before us. But the strange thing is, even mainstream scientists have quietly admitted the possibility. In recent years, thinkers have explored what's called the Silurian Hypothesis, a thought experiment asking whether an industrial civilization could have existed long before humans and whether its traces would survive. Their conclusion? It's possible. But it would be almost impossible to prove. That's the unsettling part. We live in a world built on the assumption that history is fixed and knowable. But the truth is, our timeline is stitched together with fragments. Every year, new discoveries force textbooks to be rewritten. Every time we dig deeper, the picture of the past becomes more complicated. So what happens if the biggest rewrite of all is still waiting for us, hidden under our feet or sitting unnoticed in plain sight? The possibility of a first civilization raises questions that cut to the core of who we are. If it existed, what happened to it? Was it wiped out by disaster, by war, or by its own mistakes? Could it have been more advanced than us in some ways, mastering sciences or technologies we can't even imagine? And if so, did they leave anything behind? Not just ruins or myths, but knowledge, clues, warnings. Some theorists suggest that they did. They point to mysterious monuments, unexplained artifacts, or sudden leaps in ancient knowledge. They ask whether the great civilizations we know, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, were truly the originators of human progress, or whether they were inheritors of a forgotten legacy. Imagine if that were true. It would mean that our proudest achievements, our mathematics, our architecture, our understanding of the stars, might not be original at all. They might be hand-me-downs from a civilization so old its name is lost to time. And yet, the strangest thought of all is this. What if we are that first civilization? What if we are the beginning, and all of those myths and mysteries are just echoes of human imagination trying to give shape to the unknown? If that's the case, then this story becomes even more haunting. Because if we are the first, then the survival of everything we've built rests on our shoulders alone. And history has shown again and again how fragile civilizations can be. As we go deeper into this idea, we'll explore the science, the legends, the conspiracy theories, and the discoveries that fuel the belief in a forgotten origin of humanity. We'll look at what evidence exists, what's been challenged, and what might still be hiding beneath the surface of our world. Because whether you believe the theory or not, one thing is certain. The past is full of secrets, and some of them may be far older and far stranger than we've ever been told. But before we dive into myths and conspiracies, let's start with the surprising fact. Even mainstream science has considered the possibility of lost civilizations, not in myth, not in rumour, but in cold geological terms. And the conclusions might shock you. If there really was a first civilization, something advanced, industrial, and long before humans, then science itself should have the tools to find it. That's where something called the Silurian Hypothesis comes in. The name sounds like it belongs in a sci-fi show, and in a way, it does. The term Silurian was borrowed from a race of ancient reptilian beings in Doctor Who, creatures imagined to have developed advanced technology millions of years before humans. But in 2018, two respected scientists, Gavin Schmidt, a climate scientist at NASA, and Adam Frank, an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester, used that name for a very real scientific question. Would it be possible to detect an industrial civilization in Earth's deep past, millions of years before humans ever appeared? Their thought experiment wasn't about proving such a civilization existed. Instead, It asked what traces would be left if it did, and their conclusions were as fascinating as they were unsettling. Schmidt and Frank pointed out that if an industrial civilization rose and fell tens of millions of years ago, direct evidence, like buildings, machines, or even bones, would almost certainly be gone. The Earth is a recycling machine. Oceans rise, mountains erode, continents shift, and glaciers scrape the surface clean. Over long enough timescales, nearly everything disappears. To put it in perspective, the oldest large-scale human structures we know, like the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of Mesopotamia, are only a few thousand years old. Fossils of dinosaurs, which we know dominated Earth for over 160 million years, are rare and fragmented despite their sheer numbers. If it's hard to find bones of creatures that once weighed 30 tons, how much harder would it be to find evidence of a city, a machine, or a road hundreds of millions of years later? The conclusion: if an early civilization did exist, we probably wouldn't find its skyscrapers or its tools. Instead, we'd have to look for indirect evidence, strange fingerprints left in the geological record. What kind of fingerprints might survive? The scientists pointed to several possibilities. Chemical residues in the soil. Our modern industry releases synthetic chemicals, plastics, and heavy metals. Some of these break down quickly, but others can persist. Even millions of years from now, unusual chemical signatures might remain trapped in sediments. Carbon isotope anomalies. Burning fossil fuels leaves a distinct chemical fingerprint in the atmosphere and in rocks, changes in the balance of carbon isotopes. If another civilization burned carbon-based fuels, they too would leave a spike in the record. Mass extinctions and climate change. Industrial activity can change the climate dramatically. If ancient Earth suddenly warmed or cooled in ways unexplained by natural cycles, that could be a clue. A civilization capable of altering its environment would leave behind the evidence of its own footprint. Sediment patterns, agriculture, deforestation, and large-scale engineering projects all change how rivers and oceans deposit sediment. An ancient civilization might have shifted entire landscapes in ways that future geologists could detect. The eerie part is that when Schmidt and Frank looked at the geological record, they admitted that we already see anomalies like this. Take the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum about 56 million years ago. Earth's temperature suddenly spiked by as much as 8 degrees Celsius. The oceans acidified. Many species vanished. The cause? Still debated. Some scientists suggest volcanic activity. Others point to massive releases of methane. But Schmidt and Frank asked, what if this warming event was also consistent with industrial activity? What if an ancient civilization burned fuels or altered the environment so dramatically that its effects lingered in the rocks? No one claims that's what happened, but the fact that the geological record can't entirely rule it out is fascinating. It means the traces of a lost civilization, if one ever existed, might look almost identical to natural events. Here's the problem. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. If the Earth has the power to erase nearly everything, how could we ever prove a civilization once existed? At best, we'd find odd anomalies, spikes of carbon, layers of unusual metals, sediments that don't match expectations. But anomalies already exist, and scientists argue about their causes all the time. Without a definitive smoking gun, an unmistakable artifact older than any known human ancestor, we'd never be certain. And so, the Silurian Hypothesis leaves us with the strange paradox. It is scientifically possible that an industrial civilization existed millions of years ago, but it is almost impossible to prove. You might wonder why two highly respected scientists would even consider such an idea. For them, it wasn't just about Earth, it was about exoplanets. When astronomers search for signs of life elsewhere in the universe, they look for technosignatures, chemical or atmospheric anomalies that might suggest an alien civilization once thrived. But to understand what to look for on other planets, we first have to ask, what would our own civilization look like millions of years after it's gone? And that's where Earth's deep history becomes the best test case. If another civilization existed here before us, it would provide the perfect example. If not, then at least we can understand what our own legacy might look like. Either way, the question forces us to think about civilizations not as permanent fixtures, but as temporary layers in the story of a planet. Of course, once this idea entered the public sphere, it took on a life of its own. Conspiracy theorists and alternative historians seized on the Silurian Hypothesis as proof that scientists know more than they admit. They argue that the anomalies in Earth's past, the sudden extinctions, the unexplained warming periods, the spikes of carbon, are exactly what we'd expect from a vanished civilization. Some go even further, claiming that certain archaeological mysteries, like megalithic structures or out-of-place artifacts, are remnants that survived the erasia. Skeptics push back hard, pointing out that natural processes can explain these anomalies without invoking lost cities or ancient machines. But the seed has been planted. If mainstream science says it's possible, then who's to say the conspiracists are entirely wrong? There's another angle to the Silurian hypothesis that makes it even more haunting. If an industrial civilization really did exist long before us, then maybe it ended the same way we might, by altering the climate, exhausting resources, or triggering a catastrophe of its own making. In that sense, the idea isn't just a mystery of the past, it's a warning for our future. Imagine a civilization that rose, flourished, and collapsed, leaving behind only faint chemical scars in the rocks. Now imagine that's what we're heading toward as well. If we vanish, will the next beings to rise in millions of years find our traces, wonder about our existence, and ask the same questions we're asking now? The Silurian hypothesis doesn't prove that a first civilization existed, but it cracks the door open to the possibility. It reminds us that time is vast, the Earth is powerful, and history may not be as linear as we think. And if science can entertain that possibility, then maybe the legends and myths of lost civilizations deserve a second look too. Because if the rocks can whisper of forgotten ages, maybe the stories passed down through human memory are echoes of something real, something ancient. And that brings us to the myths themselves, the tales of golden ages, floods, and lost lands that every culture seems to remember. When Schmidt and Frank first introduced the Silurian hypothesis, they weren't trying to prove that a prehistoric civilization existed. They were trying to test how science itself thinks about evidence. But the fascinating thing about their thought experiment is how seamlessly it overlaps with the oldest human stories. Myths of lost worlds, gods descending from the skies, and golden ages destroyed by catastrophe. Think about it. If an industrial civilization had existed millions of years before us, its memory wouldn't survive in monuments or libraries. But could it survive in something less tangible? Could its shadow echo down through time as myth? One of the most striking things about human culture is the recurrence of certain archetypes. The flood that drowns the world, the wise beings who teach human skills, the sudden fall from a golden age into darkness. Mainstream historians interpret these as symbolic stories, ways for ancient people to make sense of the natural world. But from the perspective of the Silurian Hypothesis, they take on a more unsettling meaning. What if these weren't only symbols? What if there were cultural memories of something real? Distant echoes of an earlier age that collapsed. Imagine a civilization capable of seeding myths into the oral traditions of early humans, whether deliberately or accidentally. Imagine survivors of a catastrophe passing on fragments of their story in allegories, metaphors, and warnings. This isn't as far-fetched as it might sound. We already know that oral traditions can preserve memory for astonishing lengths of time. Indigenous Australian stories describe sea levels rising and swallowing coastal lands, tales that match geological events from nearly 10,000 years ago. If memory can stretch across 10,000 years, why couldn't fragments survive even longer, twisted and reshaped by time? The Silurian Hypothesis encourages us to look at anomalies not as mistakes in the record, but as potential fingerprints. Over the years, explorers and miners have stumbled upon what some call OOPArts, out-of-place artifacts. These range from mysterious metal spheres found in ancient rock layers, to supposed footprints alongside dinosaur tracks, to machinery-like objects embedded in coal. Most scientists dismiss these claims as misidentifications, hoaxes, or natural formations. But for those who entertain the Silurian perspective, OOPArts become tantalizing possibilities. If traces of an older civilization were scattered and buried, wouldn't they look exactly like this? Singular, strange objects with no clear context, dismissed because they don't fit the accepted timeline. Consider the metallic spheres of South Africa, perfectly round objects with grooves etched around their middle, reportedly found in rock formations nearly 3 billion years old. Geologists explain them as natural concretions, formations of mineral growth. But fringe researchers ask, what if they're remnants of ancient technology so eroded and deformed we no longer recognize them? Then there are the anomalies in isotopes, strange layers of radioactive material or unexpected spikes of carbon that don't align neatly with volcanic activity or natural cycles. To mainstream science, these are puzzles awaiting natural explanations. To theorists, they look suspiciously like the chemical fingerprints of industry, the same way our own emissions will someday scar the rock record. Here's where the Silurian Hypothesis turns from science to speculation. If such a civilization existed, when could it have flourished? Humans as we know them have only been around for a few 100,000 years, but complex life has existed for over 500 million. Dinosaurs ruled for over 160 million years. Plenty of time for another intelligent species to rise. What if intelligence wasn't unique to us? What if another species, whether reptilian, mammalian, or something entirely different, developed industry, built cities, and eventually collapsed long before humans ever walked the earth? We would never know their names. We might never even know their form. All we'd have are shadows in the rocks, strange chemical trails, and maybe whispers in myths we struggle to interpret. Some fringe theorists take this further, suggesting that humanity itself may carry traces of their legacy, not in buildings, but in knowledge. Could agriculture, mathematics, or astronomy have been gifts passed down from remnants of an older people? Is it possible that the sudden leaps forward in human culture, like the appearance of writing or the building of massive monuments, reflect not independent invention, but inheritance? skeptics push back by pointing out how little solid evidence exists. But from the Silurian perspective, that's exactly the point. Evidence wouldn't survive. Whole continents have disappeared under oceans. Mountain ranges have been ground into dust. Fossils are rare because the Earth recycles its surface relentlessly. This creates a convenient but also terrifying gap. If proof is almost impossible to find, then denial becomes easy. There is no evidence may be true, but it doesn't necessarily mean it never happened. In fact, the very nature of geology makes it almost impossible to close the case either way, and that's why conspiracy theorists latch onto it. Because the absence of proof becomes its own kind of proof. They argue that the gaps in history, the anomalies in science, the missing records in archaeology, all of it fits a pattern. A story where the first civilization is not just forgotten, but deliberately erased. But whether you accept the conspiracy angle or not, the Silurian Hypothesis forces us to face a sobering truth. Civilizations are temporary. Earth has seen mass extinctions, sudden climate shifts, and catastrophic events over and over. If an industrial civilization existed before us, it was erased. If it could happen once, it can happen again. That's why Schmidt and Frank's thought experiment matters even outside the realm of speculation. It isn't just about what might have happened millions of years ago. It's about what might happen millions of years from now. Will our own legacy be anything more than a few chemical scars in the rocks? Will future beings wonder if a civilization existed here before them, just as we now wonder about our own predecessors? This is where science hands the baton to story. Because while geology struggles to hold on to memories, human culture does something strange. It retells, reinvents, and repeats. Myths echo across continents. Floods, lost lands, golden ages. And though historians treat them as fiction, the Silurian Hypothesis invites us to see them differently. What if the geological record and the mythological record are two halves of the same story? Rocks remember in chemistry and humans remember in tales. Put them together, and the possibility of a first civilization begins to look less like fantasy and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. And that's where we turn next. The myths themselves. Legends of Atlantis, whispers of gods who walk the earth, and stories of ages of man rising and falling. Stories that may not be fiction at all, but distant echoes of a civilization lost to time. If science leaves us with uncertain fingerprints, myth provides something entirely different. Memory wrapped in story. Every culture on Earth carries its own set of ancient tales, but the strange thing is how often those tales overlap. Different peoples, separated by oceans and by thousands of years, tell stories that sound suspiciously alike. Floods that swallowed entire worlds. Gods who descended from the skies to teach agriculture, astronomy, and law. Golden ages of prosperity that ended in sudden catastrophe. To historians, these similarities are often explained as coincidence. Floods are common events. Gods are metaphors for human hopes and fears. But to those who suspect an older civilization lurks in the shadows of history, myths aren't just stories. They're fragments of memory, echoes of something so old, its details warped and blurred, yet persistent enough to survive across generations. Let's start with the most famous myth of all, the Flood. In Mesopotamia, one of humanity's oldest written tales, the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a massive flood sent by the gods to wipe out humanity, with one man, Utnapishtim, surviving in a great boat. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah mirrors it almost exactly. In Hindu tradition, the god Vishnu warns Manu of a flood and tells him to build a boat. In Greek myth, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus to punish humanity. Travel halfway around the world and you'll find the same tale among the Maya, the Aztecs, and even among indigenous peoples of North America and Australia. Entirely separate cultures, yet all with stories of waters rising, worlds drowning, and survivors rebuilding afterward. Mainstream explanations argue these are local memories of regional floods, exaggerated into myth. But if you look at them through the lens of a first civilization, the pattern changes. What if these weren't separate coincidences? What if they were cultural memories of a single catastrophic event that destroyed something older, something larger, an advanced civilization whose remnants became the seed for all the stories that followed? Some point to the Younger Dryas period, around 12,800 years ago, when sudden climate shifts melted glaciers and caused sea levels to rise dramatically. Entire coastlines vanished underwater. If a civilization existed then, its cities may now lie on seabeds, erased from the archaeological record. And the survivors, perhaps they told their children stories of the world that drowned, stories that grew into the global flood myths we know today. Floods aren't the only repeating story. Across cultures there are myths of figures, sometimes described as gods, sometimes as wise strangers, who appear after catastrophe to teach humanity the arts of civilization. In ancient Egypt, the god Osiris was said to have travelled the land teaching agriculture, law, and religion. Among the Sumerians, the figure Oan emerged from the sea to share knowledge of writing, architecture, and governance. In Mesoamerican traditions, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, arrived after great upheaval to teach astronomy, calendars, and crafts. The parallels are striking. Time and again we hear of culture bringers who show up not at the dawn of humanity, but in the aftermath of disaster. If we look at these stories not as divine myths, but as cultural memories, a provocative question emerges. Were these gods actually survivors from an older civilization? Survivors who carried fragments of knowledge with them, scattering it among the rebuilding peoples of the world? Of course, no discussion of lost civilizations is complete without Atlantis. The story comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote of a mighty island civilization that flourished beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. According to Plato, Atlantis was powerful, wealthy, and technologically advanced, but pride led to its downfall. In a single day and night, it sank beneath the sea. For centuries, Atlantis has been treated as allegory, a moral fable about hubris, but it has also become the centerpiece of alternative history. Some see it as a memory of a real place swallowed by rising seas after the last ice age. Others suggest it wasn't just a city but a global network of advanced people, erased in catastrophe. The details may be hazy, but the persistence of the idea is remarkable. Atlantis isn't just one story. It has sparked echoes in countless cultures, from the Aztec tales of Aztlan to Celtic, legends of sunken lands off the British coast. Almost everywhere we look, we find myths of great realms swallowed by water, coincidence or cultural memory of a lost world, floods, gods, lost islands. These aren't isolated myths. They appear in clusters. The Dogon people of Mali tell of beings from the star Sirius who taught them advanced astronomy. Polynesian myths speak of great navigators who arrived from lands long gone. In South America, legends tell of Viracocha, a bearded stranger who came after a flood to restore order and share knowledge. In each case, the pattern repeats: a disaster, followed by the arrival of knowledge bringers, followed by the rise of new civilizations. It's as though humanity was rebooted multiple times, always with the help of figures who seem to come from outside. Mainstream historians see these as common human themes. But if we entertain the possibility of a first civilization, the myths look different. They look like scattered pieces of a story where survivors carried fragments of technology and wisdom, seeding the rise of later cultures. It's important to note that myths are not history books. They're fluid, symbolic, and often exaggerated. Water, for example, is a natural symbol of chaos and destruction, so floods may represent more than literal events. Gods may simply reflect the human tendency to personify the unknown. But the sheer consistency across cultures raises questions. Why do so many civilizations separated by oceans share such similar stories? Why do the same themes, floods, golden ages, wise strangers, appear again and again? For those who believe in a first civilization, the answer is simple. Because they're all remembering the same thing. Here's another angle. Imagine you're one of the survivors of a global catastrophe. You've lost your city, your technology, your culture. You and a handful of others must rebuild with what little remains. How do you pass on warnings of what happened? You tell stories. You warn your children with myths, with parables, with tales of gods who punished arrogance or floods that swept the unprepared away. Over time, the details blur, the names change, but the core of the story survives. What began as memory becomes myth, and what began as myth becomes the backbone of cultural identity. In that sense, the myths may not just be stories, they may be survival strategies, fragments of history designed to outlast the loss of everything else. Some argue that myths aren't the only things left behind. What if certain monuments, aligned with the stars or constructed with impossible precision, are also part of that memory? The pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Stonehenge, the mysterious structures of Pumapunku in Bolivia, all of them are said to encode astronomical knowledge, alignments and techniques that seem beyond their supposed age. If survivors of a first civilization carried fragments of knowledge, perhaps they passed them on, through both story and stone. Perhaps the myths are the spoken memory, and the monuments are the physical memory, two sides of the same legacy. At the heart of it all are the so-called gods, figures who arrive out of nowhere, bringing knowledge, reshaping the world and then vanishing. Were they purely mythological? Or were they in some sense real? Survivors of a civilization erased by time, remembered as divine because of the wisdom they carried? It's a question that has haunted humanity for millennia, and it's one that sets the stage for the next layer of our journey, when myth begins to blend with alleged history. Because beyond stories and legends, there are theories of lost empires, erased timelines, and civilizations deliberately written out of the record. And some of those theories are stranger than fiction. When we strip away the poetry of myth and look at these figures more closely, a strange pattern emerges. The gods who supposedly taught humanity aren't just vague symbols of the sun or the sea. They often have very specific roles. They bring agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, architecture or laws. They don't just represent nature, they represent civilization itself. And if we take the possibility of a first civilization seriously, that detail changes everything. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Osiris wasn't just a ruler of the dead. He was remembered as a king who once walked the earth, teaching agriculture, laws and social order. He travelled across Egypt bringing knowledge, and only after his death did he become associated with the afterlife. Why would a god of death be remembered as a teacher of farming and law? Some researchers suggest Osiris may be more than myth. He may be a cultural memory of someone, perhaps a real leader or group of survivors, who appeared in the Nile Valley after Catastrophe. His teachings could represent the passing down of knowledge from an older civilization, disguised over time in divine imagery. The Egyptians themselves never claimed to be the first civilization. Their priests told Greek historians that their knowledge came from earlier times, preserved across ages of fire and flood. What if Osiris was their way of encoding that inheritance? On the other side of the world, the Aztecs remembered Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god. Unlike the fearsome war gods of their pantheon, Quetzalcoatl was a teacher. He gave humans maize, the basis of Mesoamerican agriculture. He taught them writing, calendars, and astronomy. Some legends even describe him as a pale, bearded man who came from the east, which fueled centuries of speculation. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, some Aztecs initially believed they were connected to Quetzalcoatl's promised return. That belief was later exploited and mythologized, but the deeper question remains. Why did the Aztecs remember their civilizing god not as a warrior, but as a knowledge bringer? And why did his story echo the tales of Osiris and Uans across the ocean? In the Andes, the Inca told of Viracocha, a creator god who emerged after a great flood had destroyed an earlier age. He brought order, taught skills, and travelled across the land disguised as a man. Like Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha was remembered as a bearded figure, foreign in appearance, who departed across the sea after completing his mission. Again, we see the pattern: a catastrophic flood, survivors, and then a mysterious teacher who rebuilds civilization from the ashes. The parallels between Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, and Osiris are uncanny. Were these independent inventions of human imagination, or scattered memories of the same event, refracted through different cultures? The Babylonians told of Oannes, a half-man, half-fish figure who rose from the sea each day to teach humans writing, architecture, agriculture, and law. He returned to the water each night, and eventually other Apkallu, wise beings, followed him, bringing knowledge of civilization. The detail here is striking. Oannes didn't teach humans to hunt or to build fires. He taught them literacy and architecture, sophisticated skills that usually take centuries to evolve. Why would an ancient people imagine a fishman delivering writing unless they were trying to encode something extraordinary? Some theorists argue that Oannes was a mythologized survivor, remembered as half-fish because he came by sea, carrying the knowledge of a drowned land. Perhaps the most controversial example comes from the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa. For centuries the Dogon have held a tradition about the star Sirius. They claim their ancestors were taught by beings called the Nommo, who came from Sirius. According to their stories, the Nommo descended to Earth in a vessel accompanied by fire and thunder, and taught humanity agriculture and spiritual lore. What makes this story so provocative is the Dogon's astronomical knowledge. They've long claimed that Sirius is actually a binary system with an invisible companion star, something modern astronomy only confirmed with telescopes in the 20th century. Skeptics argue that French anthropologists may have influenced the Dogon stories, or that later contact corrupted the myth. But believers see it as evidence that the Dogon preserved advanced astronomical knowledge from a lost civilization, or from teachers not of this earth. A pattern. Too clear to ignore, across Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Andes, Mesoamerica, and Africa, we find the same core themes: a great catastrophe, often a flood, the arrival of wise beings or gods afterward, the teaching of civilization, agriculture, astronomy, writing, architecture, the departure of the teachers, often vanishing mysteriously or promising to return. It's a cycle: destruction, survival, renewal. To those who believe in a first civilization, this pattern is no coincidence. It's the memory of survivors who scattered across the globe carrying fragments of knowledge. Different cultures remembered them with different names: Osiris, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and the Nomo. But the story is the same. Humanity didn't invent civilization from scratch. It was taught, passed down like a torch from a people who had already lived through disaster. Of course, mainstream scholars push back. They argue that these myths reflect universal human concerns: floods as symbols of chaos, gods as personifications of order, agriculture as the foundation of survival. Human societies, they say, will naturally create similar myths when facing similar challenges. But believers counter with a simple question. If these stories are purely symbolic, why are they so detailed? Why do they focus not just on survival, but on specific skills, writing, astronomy, architecture, that appeared suddenly in history? Why do flood myths align so well with geological events like the end of the Ice Age? Here's the most provocative interpretation. The gods weren't gods at all. They were the last remnants of a lost civilization, survivors who emerged after catastrophe, carrying the burden of memory. To traumatized, scattered human groups, they would have seemed divine, wielding knowledge far beyond their reach. Over time, their mortal identities blurred into myth. Imagine it. Ships arriving on foreign shores, carrying survivors of a drowned land. They teach farming, writing, and architecture to hunter-gatherers. They warn of floods and destruction. They depart, leaving legends in their wake. Thousands of years later, those legends harden into religion. And in that way, the first civilization may have survived. Not in stone or metal, but in the myths we still tell today. If this is true, then myths are not just entertainment or morality tales. They are encoded memory, the last will of a civilization erased from history. They are a message. We were here before you, and we lost everything. And maybe that's why these myths are so powerful. They don't just explain the world, they warn us. They remind us that civilizations rise and fall, that pride leads to collapse, that floods can drown cities and knowledge can be forgotten. Which brings us to the next step in the mystery. If the myths are true, and if survivors carried knowledge into the future, then maybe they left more than stories. Maybe they left physical traces too, ruins, monuments, and artifacts that don't fit neatly into the accepted timeline. And that's where we encounter the most controversial claims of all: hidden empires, phantom centuries, and civilizations erased not by nature, but by deliberate rewriting of history. If myths and legends give us echoes of something older, then conspiracy theories offer something more dramatic. The claim that the evidence of a first civilization is all around us, but hidden, mislabeled, or even deliberately erased. To believers, history as we know it isn't just incomplete, it's been tampered with. Three theories stand out as the pillars of this argument: the Tartarian Empire, the Phantom Time Hypothesis, and the New Chronology. Each suggests in its own way that the world we think we know is a patchwork story, stitched together to hide a deeper truth. The theory of Tartaria, or Tartary, emerged from fringe corners of the internet, but in just a few years it exploded into one of the most popular alternative histories online. The claim is bold. A massive, global empire called Tartaria once existed, building magnificent architecture, creating advanced technology, and spreading across much of the world. But in the 19th and early 20th centuries, its history was erased through what believers call the Mud Flood. According to the theory, Many of the world's great buildings, ornate cathedrals, grand government halls, railway stations with impossible detail, weren't built in the 18th or 19th centuries as history says. They were inherited from Tartaria. Evidence, believers argue, is everywhere. Buildings with buried lower floors suggesting they were once covered in mud, architectural styles that seem too advanced for their time, and maps from centuries ago that label huge regions of Asia as Tartary. Mainstream historians dismiss Tartaria as a mix of misinterpretation and nostalgia. Yes, maps did once call Northern Asia Tartary, but it was a vague label for lands inhabited by various nomadic groups, not a unified empire. Yes, ornate architecture exists, but it was built by known societies in known time periods. As for the mud flood, archaeologists explain it as a mix of urban development, rising street levels, and natural sedimentation. But to believers, the official explanations only deepen suspicion. If Tartaria was a lie, why does the architecture look so similar across continents? Why do so many buildings have bricked-in windows, as if they were never designed for the ground level we see today? Why were old maps rewritten, and why is Tartary now a forgotten name? At its core, the Tartaria theory suggests not just a lost civilization, but a deliberate cover-up, a rewriting of history to erase the legacy of an empire that once spanned the world. If Tartaria challenges the existence of a forgotten empire, the phantom time hypothesis challenges time itself. Proposed in the 1990s by German historian Herbert Illig, the theory claims that nearly 3 centuries of the early Middle Ages, roughly 614 to 911 AD, never actually happened. According to Illig, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire and the Vatican conspired to rewrite history, fabricating entire centuries to legitimize their power. He argued that the evidence for this period is suspiciously thin, few reliable records, gaps in archaeology, and suspiciously similar architecture across supposed centuries. Even the dating of artifacts, he suggested, could be manipulated by errors in the calendar system. In Illig's view, the year was artificially padded so that the reign of Emperor Charlemagne and other rulers would appear more ancient and legitimate. If true, this would mean we're not living in the year 2025, but something closer to 1725. Mainstream historians have largely dismissed the hypothesis, pointing to abundant evidence for those centuries, astronomical observations, records in other parts of the world, and archaeological continuity. But the idea refuses to die. For conspiracy theorists, the phantom time hypothesis proves that history can be, and has been, deliberately rewritten. And if entire centuries can be fabricated, who's to say entire civilizations couldn't be erased? If phantom time questions a few centuries, the new chronology questions almost everything. Developed by Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko, this theory argues that most of human history as we know it has been artificially extended, duplicated, or misdated. According to Fomenko, events described in ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt were not separate civilizations, but different accounts of the same events, shifted in time by clerical errors or deliberate manipulation. He suggests that much of recorded history before the 11th century is unreliable, and that the true timeline of human civilization is far shorter, maybe only 1,000 years old. Fomenko's methods mix statistical analysis of texts with bold reinterpretations of astronomical data. Critics call his work pseudoscience, but for those drawn to conspiracy, the new chronology offers a radical promise that nearly everything we've been taught about the past is false. And if the timeline has been manipulated so thoroughly, then perhaps the true first civilization has been hidden entirely, buried beneath layers of manufactured history. If these theories were true, the obvious question is, why? Why would anyone erase Tartaria, invent phantom centuries, or rewrite the entire timeline? Believers suggest several motives. Some argue it's about control. If you control the past, you control identity, power, and the future. Others believe it's about ownership. By erasing or rewriting older civilizations, modern empires could claim their achievements as their own. Still, others see it as a deeper conspiracy. That knowledge of a first civilization has been deliberately hidden because it would shatter the foundations of religion, science, and politics. After all, if humans weren't the first advanced civilization, then everything we believe about progress, uniqueness, and destiny would be thrown into question. Mainstream scholarship pushes back hard on these theories, often pointing out logical gaps or misinterpretations. Buried buildings are usually explained by centuries of urban development. Missing centuries are filled in by records from outside Europe, like in China or the Middle East, and the duplication of events in new chronology often ignores context, archaeology, and linguistics. But here's the thing. Conspiracy theories thrive in the gaps, not the certainties. Every crack in the historical record, every unanswered question, every anomaly becomes fuel for the fire. And history, like geology, is full of cracks. Taken together, these theories, Tartaria, phantom time, and new chronology, aren't just about specific empires or dates. They're about trust. Do we trust the story we've been told? Or do we suspect that history, like myth, is a carefully crafted tale hiding something deeper? If we combine the lessons of the myths with the suspicions of the conspiracies, the picture becomes startling. A global civilization once flourished. Catastrophe erased it. Survivors passed their knowledge into myths, monuments, and scattered fragments. And later, powers rewrote history to bury the truth, leaving us with only hints and anomalies. It's a story both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because it suggests our understanding of the past is a lie. Exhilarating because it hints at a forgotten legacy waiting to be uncovered. And this brings us to the next step in the journey. If myths are memory and conspiracies claim erasure, what about the evidence we can actually touch? The stones, the ruins, the monuments that defy explanation. In recent decades, archaeologists have uncovered sites that don't fit the neat timeline, places far older and more sophisticated than expected. These discoveries suggest that civilization is not just older than we thought, it may be much older. And in them, some see the fingerprints of the first civilization itself. If the Tartaria, phantom time, and new chronology theories are even partly true, then the most compelling evidence isn't in dusty manuscripts or suspicious maps. It's standing right in front of us, etched in stone, cast in iron, and carved into monuments that seem to defy explanation. Believers argue that architecture itself is the silent witness to a forgotten civilization. You can't rewrite a building the way you can rewrite a book. You can cover it, bury it, or repurpose it, but the stones still speak. And what they seem to say doesn't always match the story in the textbooks. Walk through the older parts of almost any major city, and you might notice something strange. Buildings with their lower floors buried beneath street level, windows bricked up underground, doorways that open directly into the soil, entire facades hidden beneath layers of earth. Urban historians explain this as the natural rise of street levels over centuries, roads built up, sediments deposited, renovations made. But mud flood theorists see something else. they claim a global disaster once swept across the world, burying whole cities in mud. Afterward, later generations simply dug out the upper stories and built new streets on top, leaving the lower levels entombed. Photographs from the 19th century show workers excavating buildings with multiple underground windows, basements that look suspiciously like former ground floors. To the mudflood believer, this isn't urban development. It's evidence that something catastrophic happened, and that the modern cities we inhabit are just the exposed tips of much older buried structures. Then, there are the megalithic structures scattered across the world. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza is built with stones so massive and so precisely cut that modern engineers still debate how it was achieved. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, giant interlocking stones fit, together with such precision that even a knife blade cannot slide between them. In Bolivia, at Pumapunku, blocks of andesite were carved with near-machine precision, featuring right angles and drill-like holes. Mainstream archaeology attributes these feats to remarkable craftsmanship, persistence, and ingenuity of ancient peoples. But alternative theorists see something else: evidence of advanced technology, either inherited from or directly created by a forgotten civilization. They argue that the precision is beyond the tools supposedly available at the time. If humans 2,000 years ago could do this, then why did later cultures often build with far cruder methods? The question lingers: were these megaliths the remnants of an earlier knowledge base, a legacy passed down from survivors of a first civilization? Even more puzzling to some are the grand cathedrals of Europe. Many were supposedly built in the Middle Ages, yet they display levels of symmetry, mathematical precision, and acoustic design that seem out of place for the time. Mudflood believers argue that many of these buildings weren't constructed in the medieval period at all. They were inherited from Tartaria. Take the intricate rose windows, the perfect acoustics of domes, or the hidden geometry based on advanced mathematics. Some researchers point out that similar principles appear across continents, in mosques, temples, and even government buildings. How did cultures supposedly separated by geography and centuries produce such uniform styles? The mainstream explanation is diffusion of ideas and shared aesthetics. But conspiracy theorists insist these are the fingerprints of a unified architectural knowledge, evidence of a global civilization whose works were later claimed by others. Beyond architecture, there are the smaller anomalies, the so-called ooparts, or out-of-place artifacts. In India, the iron pillar of Delhi has resisted rust for over 1,600 years, baffling metallurgists who struggle to explain its unusual resistance to corrosion. In 1938, the Baghdad battery was unearthed. Clay jars with copper and iron fittings that some believe could have generated electricity. In coal mines and rock strata, occasional reports surface of objects that shouldn't be there. Metal spheres, tools, or even imprints resembling gears. Most are dismissed as natural formations or hoaxes, but they continue to fuel speculation. If these anomalies were isolated, they'd be curiosities, but in the narrative of a first civilization they become potential clues, artifacts that slipped through the cracks of time, fragments of a story almost entirely erased. Here's where the theories converge. The Tartaria believers argue that magnificent buildings were inherited, not built. The phantom time theorists claim centuries were fabricated to hide inconsistencies. The new chronology says nearly the entire timeline of civilization has been distorted. Together, they paint a picture of a history so deeply altered that the ancient world and the modern world may not be as separate as we think. Instead, they suggest there was a reset. An advanced global culture flourished, was struck down by disaster, whether natural or engineered, and its survivors left fragments behind. Later generations stumbled across those fragments, repurposed them, and then rewrote the story to make it their own. If this is true, then our entire understanding of progress is inverted. Humanity didn't slowly climb from the Stone Age to skyscrapers. We fell from a peak, lost nearly everything, and have been clawing our way back ever since. The darker side of the theory is the idea of suppression. If evidence of a first civilization exists, why isn't it accepted? Believers argue that powerful institutions, whether governments, religious authorities, or academic elites, have reasons to protect the established narrative. If we learned that a global empire once existed, what would that mean for national pride, cultural identity, or religious doctrine? If we discovered that our most advanced knowledge was actually a hand-me-down, would it undermine the belief in modern superiority? And if catastrophic resets have happened before, would it remind us of our own fragility, our own looming collapse? Conspiracy theorists argue that it's easier to bury the past, literally and figuratively, than to face those questions. And so, the story goes, Tartaria was erased, phantom centuries were invented, and the timeline was bent into its current shape. Whether you accept these claims or not, they set the stage for the most intriguing part of the puzzle, archaeology itself. Because even without invoking secret empires or erased centuries, new discoveries are constantly forcing us to rethink history. Sites appear that are older, bigger, or more complex than anyone expected. Discoveries emerge that challenge the neat, linear story of civilization's rise. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, for instance, rewrote human history when it was discovered. Massive stone temples, intricately carved, built around 11,000 years ago, long before humans were supposed to have developed organized religion or monumental architecture. If humans could build something like Göbekli Tepe that early, what else might we be missing? What else might still lie buried, waiting to tell us a story that no theory, mainstream or fringe, has yet imagined? And that leads us into the next chapter, the archaeological surprises that may be more than anomalies. They may be glimpses of a civilization far older than we ever dared to believe. If myths are memory and conspiracy theories are suspicion, archaeology is the battlefield where these ideas clash with hard evidence. Stones don't lie, but they can puzzle, and in recent decades, archaeologists have uncovered sites that make the neat timeline of human history look less like a ladder and more like a jigsaw puzzle. Each new discovery seems to whisper the same unsettling message: civilization is older, stranger, and more complex than we thought. High in the hills of southeastern Turkey lies Göbekli Tepe, a site that rewrote history the moment it was uncovered. Discovered in the 1990s and still being excavated today, it's a series of massive stone circles with towering pillars, carved with animals, abstract symbols, and possibly even celestial maps. The shocking part: Göbekli Tepe is over 11,000 years old. That's 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Giza, older than agriculture, at least according to the traditional timeline. Mainstream archaeology struggles with this site because it doesn't fit the narrative. Hunter-gatherers weren't supposed to be building temples with 20-ton stones. They weren't supposed to organize large workforces or plan astronomical alignments. Yet Göbekli Tepe proves they did. To believers in a first civilization, Göbekli Tepe is more than an anomaly. It's evidence. A reminder that human societies may have inherited knowledge far earlier than we admit. Perhaps it was a project guided by survivors of a forgotten world, teaching humans to align stones with the stars and encode sacred symbols. Perhaps the reason it was deliberately buried, as evidence suggests, was to hide that legacy until the time was right. Cross the ocean to Louisiana, and you'll find another puzzle: Poverty Point. Built around 3,500 years ago, it consists of massive earthen ridges, mounds and plazas arranged with striking geometric precision. Archaeologists estimate that over 750,000 cubic meters of earth were moved to create it, all without beasts of burden, metal tools, or wheels. Even stranger, the site shows evidence of long-distance trade. Materials like copper, soapstone and galena came from hundreds of miles away. This wasn't a small village. It was a hub of a sophisticated network. For years, scholars downplayed the significance of Poverty Point, assuming that North America's early peoples were primitive compared to Old World civilizations. But the evidence tells a different story. These were engineers, planners and traders who achieved feats rivaling their contemporaries in Mesopotamia or Egypt. To alternative historians, Poverty Point is part of a broader pattern. Around the world, supposedly simple cultures built monumental works long before the timeline allows. Were they truly inventing from scratch, or inheriting blueprints from something older? On the tiny island of Pohnpei in Micronesia lies Nan Madol, often called the Venice of the Pacific. It's a sprawling city of over 90 artificial islets, linked by canals, built from massive basalt logs weighing up to 50 tons each. The structures rise straight out of the ocean, with walls stacked like giant black Lego bricks. Nan Madol was reportedly the seat of a powerful dynasty that flourished around 1000 AD. But the sheer scale and logistics of the site leave archaeologists baffled. How were 50-ton stones quarried, transported across water, and stacked with such precision on a remote island with limited resources? Local legends tell of sorcery, of gods levitating the stones into place. Believers in lost civilizations hear something else: echoes of forgotten technology. Was Nan Madol the work of an isolated island society, or the last outpost of something larger, something older, clinging to memory as the rest of the world moved on? Then there are the ruins beneath the sea. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers discovered submerged structures that appear to be man-made, with walls, steps and grids resembling streets. In Japan, off Yonaguni, a massive stone formation lies under the waves, with terraces, steps and flat surfaces that look uncannily artificial. Geologists argue about whether these are natural formations, shaped by erosion, or genuine ruins of sunken cities. If they are man-made, they push the timeline of advanced settlement back thousands of years, to a time when mainstream history insists no such societies existed. And here, once again, the flood myths creep back in. Entire cities swallowed by water, remembered only in legend, waiting for divers to stumble upon their remains. If Atlantis was real, perhaps it isn't just one place, but many. An entire age of coastal civilizations drowned as seas rose after the Ice Age. Even the most famous monuments still hold mysteries. The pyramids of Giza, supposedly built around 2500 BC, are aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. Their layout mirrors the belt of Orion. Their construction techniques remain debated: ramps, levers, counterweights, but no definitive explanation has silenced the skeptics. In South America, pyramids in Caral, Peru, date back to 2600 BC, rivaling the age of Egypt's. In Central America, Maya pyramids align with solstices and equinoxes, serving as giant astronomical calculators. Why did so many cultures separated by oceans build nearly identical monuments? Mainstream archaeology says pyramids are simply a stable way to build tall structures, but believers see something else, a shared legacy, passed down across continents. When you line up these discoveries, Göbekli Tepe, Poverty Point, Nan Madol, underwater ruins, pyramids on every continent, they begin to look less like isolated anomalies and more like a pattern. A pattern that suggests advanced knowledge kept appearing in places where it shouldn't. The mainstream view is cautious. Human ingenuity, convergent evolution of ideas, and a reminder not to underestimate ancient peoples. But to those searching for the first civilization, these sites are the fingerprints of something bigger, a legacy scattered across the globe waiting to be pieced together. Here's the provocative thought. What if the first civilization isn't completely lost? What if its ruins are everywhere, but we misinterpret them because we expect them to fit our timeline? Göbekli Tepe becomes a hunter-gatherer anomaly. Poverty Point becomes an exceptional native site. Nan Madol becomes a local curiosity. Each is explained away in isolation, when together they might tell a larger story. Maybe the reason we struggle to see the first civilization is because we've already found it. We just don't recognize it for what it is. But if such a civilization existed, we must ask the obvious. What happened to it? How could something so advanced vanish so completely? The answer may lie not in stones or myths, but in catastrophe. Because history shows us one thing above all else. Civilizations don't just fade quietly. They fall, and often they fall hard. And that brings us to the next chapter of this mystery. The disasters, both natural and possibly deliberate, that could erase entire worlds, leaving only fragments for us to find thousands of years later. Civilizations don't disappear quietly. They leave scars, ruins and legends, but sometimes those scars are so large that we mistake them for natural features, and sometimes the legends are so strange that we dismiss them as myth. If a first civilization really existed, then something must have destroyed it. The question is, what kind of force is powerful enough to erase nearly everything, leaving only fragments of stone, whispers of myth, and anomalies in the rocks? The possibilities fall into two categories. Some are natural, immense disasters written into the planet's DNA. Others, more troubling, may be human, or at least the result of conscious suppression. The Earth has always been dangerous. Volcanoes, earthquakes, floods, impacts from space, each has the power to reset the clock on life itself. In fact, scientists count at least 5 major extinction events in Earth's history. Most wiped out the majority of species alive at the time. If nature can erase entire ecosystems, why not civilizations? Perhaps the most famous candidate is the Younger Dryas, around 12,800 years ago. Just as the Ice Age was ending, the climate suddenly shifted back to near-glacial conditions. Temperatures plunged, megafauna died off, and human population scattered. The cause is debated, as some say it was a burst of meltwater disrupting ocean currents. Others suggest volcanic activity, but a growing number of researchers argue it was a cosmic impact. Fragments of a comet striking the ice sheets, triggering floods, wildfires, and global cooling. If an advanced civilization existed then, this event could have erased it almost overnight. Coastal cities would have drowned as seas rose. Crops and animals would have vanished in the cold. Survivors would have been scattered bands clinging to memory, their achievements forgotten. To believers, this event aligns too perfectly with the global flood myths to be coincidence. A real catastrophe may have been remembered as the world-drowning deluge, the wrath of gods, or the fall of Atlantis. Another suspect is volcanism. The eruption of Mount Toba in Indonesia, 74,000 years ago, was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. It blanketed the Earth in ash, triggered a volcanic winter, and may have reduced human populations to a few thousand survivors. If a civilization existed before Toba, its infrastructure would have been buried under ash and destroyed by famine. Today, its remnants would be nearly impossible to detect beneath layers of volcanic debris. And then there are meteor strikes. The Chicxulub impact 66 million years ago ended the reign of the dinosaurs. Smaller impacts have occurred since, creating sudden, localized devastation. If an early industrial society existed, a single strike could have ended it, leaving little more than a thin layer of iridium in the rocks, just as the dinosaurs left behind. Even without cosmic fire or volcanic ash, the steady rise of the oceans has drowned vast swathes of land. At the end of the Ice Age, melting glaciers raised sea levels by more than 400 feet. Entire coastal plains were submerged, taking with them whatever settlements lay there. Today, over 90% of humanity lives near coastlines. If our civilization collapsed and seas rose again, most of our great cities, New York, London, Tokyo, would vanish beneath the waves. Thousands of years later, divers might stumble on their remains and argue about whether they were natural formations. Perhaps the ruins we've already found under the seas of India and Japan are just that, evidence of drowned cities from a time when coastlines looked very different. Perhaps they are the last hints of the first civilization, swallowed whole by the ocean. Even without cataclysms, time itself is the great destroyer. Stone erodes, metal rusts, wood rots. Within a few thousand years, almost every trace of a city can vanish. In the Amazon, once great settlements have been reclaimed by jungle. In the Sahara, shifting sands bury entire cultures. If our own world were to collapse tomorrow, how long would it take before skyscrapers turned to rubble, highways crumbled, and satellites fell from orbit? Within 10,000 years, nature would erase almost everything. Within 1,000,000 years, nothing would be left but faint chemical traces in the soil. This is the haunting conclusion of the Silurian Hypothesis. Even if a civilization existed millions of years ago, we may never know, because the Earth recycles its own history relentlessly. Absence of evidence is not proof of absence. It is simply proof of time's cruelty. But what if it wasn't only nature that erased the first civilization? What if parts of its story were hidden deliberately? This is where conspiracy theories step in. Believers argue that evidence of an older world may exist, but has been misdated, mislabeled, or outright suppressed. They point to objects found in impossible layers of rock, or sites excavated only to be sealed off again. They argue that institutions, universities, governments, religious authorities have incentives to keep history neat and linear. Why? Because the truth would be too disruptive. If a first civilization existed, it would challenge the narrative of human progress, undermine religious dogma, and strip modern powers of their claim to originality. Imagine the fallout if we learned our greatest inventions weren't ours at all, but inheritances from survivors of a forgotten world. Even without conspiracies, suppression can happen accidentally, or deliberately, through the loss of knowledge. The burning of the Library of Alexandria in antiquity is often cited as the greatest intellectual tragedy in history. Thousands of scrolls containing the knowledge of the ancient world were destroyed, lost forever. If a first civilization's records ever survived, perhaps they suffered a similar fate. A single war, fire, or purge could erase centuries of knowledge. In fact, some argue that the few surviving myths are the only reason we even suspect something might have been lost. History is written by victors. Empires have always destroyed or rewritten the records of those who came before them. The Spanish conquest of the Americas saw the burning of countless Maya codices, erasing entire libraries of knowledge. The Qin dynasty in China famously burned books and buried scholars alive to enforce its narrative. If we know such suppression has happened in recorded history, why would it be impossible in prehistory? Perhaps evidence of a first civilization was encountered, but dismissed, destroyed, or folded into the myths of those who inherited its ruins. Whether by fire, flood, impact, or suppression, the result is the same. Civilizations rise and fall, and memory is fragile. Each time we rebuild, we imagine we are the first. Each time we rediscover knowledge, we claim it as our own. But maybe we are not the first. Maybe we are just the latest. And if that's true, then our greatest monuments and myths aren't beginnings at all. They're echoes of a story Earth has seen before and may see again. If we accept even the possibility of a first civilization, then one final question looms. What does it mean for us? Are we walking the same path, doomed to repeat the same collapse? Are our myths not only memories but warnings? Because if another civilization once built the world before us, then our story may not be a triumphant march of progress. It may be a cycle: rise, fall, forget, repeat. And that's where we'll turn next. The implications. What it would mean for humanity if the first civilization really did build the world we know. Up to this point, we've looked at myths, anomalies, and conspiracies that hint at a forgotten civilization. We've explored how catastrophes and time itself could erase nearly every trace of a world before ours. But the most unsettling question isn't about the past, it's about the present. What if the first civilization really did build the world we know? What does that mean for us? Because if there was one before us, the implications ripple outward in ways that touch identity, technology, politics, even survival. Suddenly history isn't a straight line, it's a loop. And that changes everything. We like to imagine that civilization is permanent, that once humanity invented farming, cities, and technology, there was no turning back. But what if that's not true? What if everything we've built is as fragile as glass, one catastrophe away from being forgotten? If a first civilization once flourished, its disappearance proves that progress isn't guaranteed. Imagine standing in a ruined city 1,000 years from now. The skyscrapers are crumbling, the satellites have fallen, the power grids are silent. Without fuel, without factories, without libraries, how much of our knowledge could survive? Could we rebuild microchips, or would we return to ploughs and stone tools? If it happened before, it could happen again. And maybe the myths of floods and falls are not just memories of the past, but warnings of the future. If survivors of a first civilization seeded knowledge among later cultures, then our proudest achievements may not be ours at all. Writing, mathematics, astronomy. What if these were not inventions but inheritances? What if we are heirs without realizing it, claiming originality while standing on the ruins of giants? This changes how we think about identity. Nations and empires define themselves through their histories, through claims of being the first or the origin. But if there was a civilization before all of them, then those claims collapse. We are all inheritors of the same forgotten legacy, fragments of a story older than any nation, older than any culture we know. If the first civilization existed, How advanced could it have been? We often assume advanced means like us, electricity, machines, maybe even computers. But technology isn't always linear. Imagine a society that mastered biology instead of electronics, or sound instead of metal, or energy in ways we can't yet grasp. What if their machines weren't built of steel, but of stone or organic material that left no trace? What if they discovered ways to harness the Earth itself, or the stars in manners we wouldn't even recognize? Some theorists suggest that the strange precision of megalithic sites, or the acoustics of ancient temples, hint at technologies based on vibration, resonance, or energy manipulation. If true, then our own technological path may not be unique. It may be just one branch of many. And perhaps we've already lost entire sciences once known, waiting to be rediscovered. If the myths are memories, then they may also be warnings. Floods, fires, punishments from the gods. What if these were ways of saying, this is what happens when civilizations grow too proud, too careless? Osiris, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha. Each arrives after disaster, bearing knowledge but also caution. The myths often link hubris to downfall. Atlantis, in Plato's account, fell because it became arrogant, corrupt, and warlike. The gods destroyed it not just with water, but with moral judgment. Maybe the first civilization left us more than technology. Maybe it left us stories as a survival manual, reminders that power misused leads to collapse. If so, then ignoring those stories could mean repeating the cycle. And if suppression is real, if fragments of the first civilization exist but have been hidden, then we have to ask, why? Is it fear? Knowledge that we're not the first could destabilize religion, politics, even science. If Atlantis or Tartaria were acknowledged as real, it would shift power away from those who control the official narrative. Or perhaps it's something darker. Maybe the legacy of the first civilization isn't just knowledge, but danger. Perhaps they mastered something, an energy source, a weapon that contributed to their downfall. Maybe that knowledge was deliberately buried to protect us from repeating their mistake. And maybe the stories of forbidden knowledge, of gods punishing humanity for arrogance, are reminders not to dig too deep. Here's the most haunting implication. What if history isn't progress at all, but a cycle? Civilizations rise, they flourish, they collapse, and then memory fades. Each new society believes it is the first, when in truth it is just another turn of the wheel. The cycle may be long, tens of thousands of years, but the result is the same. Knowledge is lost, myths are born, and the process begins again. If this is true, then we aren't at the peak of human achievement. We're just midstream, repeating a story older than we can imagine. And the real question becomes, will we break the cycle, or will we vanish like those before us, leaving only whispers for the next to rediscover? Accepting a first civilization would change how we see ourselves. It would humble us, stripping away the belief that we are unique. It would unite us because it would prove that every culture shares the same forgotten roots. And it would terrify us because it would show that collapse isn't just possible, it's inevitable, unless we learn from the past. For some, this possibility is inspiring. It suggests that humanity has survived disaster before and can do so again. For others, it's chilling. It means we may already be walking a path that ends in silence. So what if the first civilization did build the world we know? Maybe its ruins are hidden in the sea, its fingerprints etched in myths, its warnings carved into stone. Maybe its survivors became our gods, its legends our religions, its failures our cautionary tales. Or maybe it is still hidden, waiting for us to uncover it fully. A discovery that would change everything: our past, our future, our place in the cosmos. Because if we're not the first, then the story of humanity is not about beginnings, it's about remembering. If the story of humanity is not about beginnings, but about remembering, then what exactly are we trying to remember? The fragments we've inherited, myths, monuments, anomalies, may not just be symbols of survival. They may be glimpses of a civilization that mastered things we can barely imagine. And if that's the case, then our understanding of advanced is far too limited. We measure progress in terms of machines, electricity, and data. But what if the first civilization measured it in ways that don't look anything like our technology? What if they explored sciences we've barely scratched, or lost entirely? One of the strangest recurring themes in ancient art is the image of flight. From the winged gods of Mesopotamia to the Vimanas of Indian epics, countless myths describe beings soaring through the skies. In Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata, Vimanas are described not as metaphor but as vehicles, chariots that flew with engines powered by something mysterious called mercury vortex propulsion. Some passages even describe aerial battles, weapons that sound eerily like modern missiles, and cities lit by unknown energies. Mainstream scholars interpret these as poetic metaphors, but conspiracy theorists ask, what if they were memories of real machines? What if the first civilization mastered flight, not with wings of wood and cloth, but with technologies lost to time? Imagine an age where skies were filled with craft we now mistake for gods, where survivors passed on fragments of these stories which became myths of angels, dragons, and divine chariots. If we found proof of such machines today, would we call them aircraft? Or would we label them unidentified and move on just as our ancestors did? The step beyond flight is space. To us, space travel is the pinnacle of modern achievement, only possible in the last half-century. But what if the first civilization looked upward long before us? Some point to the peculiar knowledge encoded in ancient monuments. The pyramids of Giza aligned to Orion's belt. Stonehenge marking solstices with uncanny precision. The Dogons claim to know about Sirius's hidden star. These could be coincidences, or they could be hints of a civilization obsessed with the heavens. If they mapped the stars with impossible accuracy, maybe it wasn't just curiosity, maybe it was necessity. Maybe they reached out to the skies in ways we don't understand. Could remnants of their journey still orbit Earth, mistaken for space debris? Could they have sent messages into the void that one day someone else, not us, will hear? And if they did reach the stars, the haunting question remains, why didn't they stay there? Did they collapse before they could escape Earth's cycle of rise and fall? Or did they leave, abandoning the planet to its next inhabitants, us? Another thread in ancient myths is creation itself, gods moulding humans from clay, breathing life into them, or engineering them from existing creatures. From Sumerian tales of the Anunnaki to Greek myths of Prometheus shaping mankind, the story of humans being made recurs across cultures. Modern readers see myth. But what if the first civilization experimented with genetics or biology in ways we cannot yet replicate? What if they altered life, not just animals or crops, but humans themselves? The sudden leap of Homo sapiens into dominance, the unexplained jumps in brain capacity, the mysterious extinction of our close cousins like the Neanderthals, all could be natural evolution. But to some, they look like intervention. What if the first civilization didn't just pass on knowledge, but helped shape us into what we are today? If true, then we're not just heirs of their world. We're their legacy, their experiment, their children. If the first civilization collapsed, wouldn't they have tried to warn the future? Perhaps they did, but not in ways we easily recognize. Some theorists suggest ancient monuments are not just temples or tombs, but messages encoded in stone. The Great Pyramid, with its mathematical precision, may be less a tomb than a dataset. A message about Earth's dimensions, time cycles, or even cataclysms. Others point to myths as coded warnings. Atlantis punished for arrogance. Babel destroyed for pride. Floods sent to cleanse. What if these aren't moral fables but survival instructions? A way of saying, this is what destroyed us, don't repeat our mistakes. If so, then maybe we're failing to listen. Climate change, nuclear weapons, unchecked consumption. Our world echoes the very warnings hidden in myth. And if history is a cycle, then ignoring those warnings may doom us to repeat the fall. The most radical speculation is this. What if the first civilization never truly disappeared? Some say they survived underground in hidden cities, waiting until the time was right to return. Others claim they left Earth entirely, becoming what we now call aliens. If that sounds impossible, remember, to hunter-gatherers, a single city of stone would seem like the work of gods. To us, the technologies of a million-year-old civilization would be indistinguishable from magic. If they are still out there, hiding, waiting, or watching, then maybe the myths of returning gods are more literal than we think. Maybe Quetzalcoatl's promised return, or the second coming of divine teachers, are echoes of survivors who never left for good. Speculation about a first civilization isn't just entertainment. It forces us to look in the mirror. If others rose and fell before us, then our own survival isn't guaranteed. The climate shifts of the Younger Dryas, the volcanic winters, the floods, they could happen again. Or worse, we could cause our own collapse, just as our myths suggest the ancients did. And maybe that's the real lesson. The first civilization, if it existed, may not be waiting for us to find it. Its greatest legacy may already be in our hands. The stories, the warnings, the strange monuments pointing to the stars, all of them whispering the same truth. You're not the first, and you may not be the last. So what if the first civilization built the world we know? It would mean that progress is fragile, memory is unreliable, and we live on borrowed time. It would mean that the gods of myth were once flesh and blood, teachers carrying the last fire of a dying age. It would mean that our monuments are not original, but echoes. Our myths are not fantasies, but records. Our history is not unique, but cyclical. And perhaps most importantly, it would mean we are standing at the same crossroads they once faced. With knowledge powerful enough to shape the earth, and pride dangerous enough to destroy it, we now face the same test. Will we endure where they fell? Or will we too vanish into myth, leaving only fragments for the next civilization to rediscover? History, as we're told it, is a neat story. A climb from caves to cities, from stone to steel, from superstition to science. But when you look closely at the myths, the ruins, the anomalies, that neat story begins to fray. Whispers of floods that drowned entire worlds. Gods who arrived bearing knowledge. Buildings that seem older and stranger than the cultures that claim them. Chemical traces in the rocks that look suspiciously like the fingerprints of industry. Taken separately, these are curiosities. Taken together, they form a pattern. A ghostly outline of something larger, A story of a world that may have existed long before ours, a civilization that built, flourished and fell, leaving only fragments behind. Maybe the first civilization is only a thought experiment, like the Silurian Hypothesis suggests. Maybe the anomalies can all be explained by chance, geology, or human imagination. But even then, the possibility itself is enough to shake us. Because if the Earth is old enough and violent enough to have erased entire worlds, then who are we to think we're permanent? If time can wipe away every skyscraper, every satellite, every record, then perhaps our own legacy will one day look exactly like theirs. Faint scars in the rocks, strange myths, whispered by descendants who barely remember us. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of this mystery. Civilizations are fragile, but memory is stubborn. Myths carry warnings across millennia. Stones stand against the weather, holding secrets we don't yet understand. Even if the first civilization fell, its echo still surrounds us, in story, in stone, in suspicion. And maybe that's the point. Maybe they knew they couldn't survive forever. Maybe their gift wasn't their monuments or their machines, but their warnings disguised as stories we've mistaken for fantasy. If the first civilization built the world we know, then the question isn't only about them, it's about us. They rose, they fell, and we inherited their shadow. Now we stand at the same precipice, with power to shape the earth and power to destroy ourselves. We can dismiss the myths, ignore the anomalies, and carry on as though we're the first and only. Or we can see them as reminders that history is not guaranteed, that memory is fragile, and that survival is not about dominance but humility. So here's the thought I'll leave you with. What if tomorrow an archaeologist uncovered proof, a fragment of machinery millions of years old, a text describing technologies we don't understand, a ruin deep beneath the ocean that predates everything we know? Would we accept it? Would we rewrite history? Or would we bury it, just as we suspect others have before us? Because maybe the first civilization isn't entirely gone. Maybe it's still here, in the stones we walk past every day, in the myths we tell our children, in the fragments waiting to be recognized. And maybe, just maybe, the world we know is not the beginning at all. It's only the middle of a story far older, far stranger, and far more fragile than we dare to believe. Maybe the greatest illusion of all is that history is linear, that it begins with us, that it climbs steadily forward, and that we are its crown jewel. But what if that illusion is only the comfort of a species too young to see the cycles it lives in? What if our age is just one chapter in a book far older than we know, a book written and rewritten across deep time, each civilization scribbling its notes before the page turns? When you step back and look at the patterns, it's hard not to wonder. Flood myths from every corner of the globe, temples and pyramids aligned with the stars, stories of gods who teach farming, writing and law, anomalies in the rocks that whisper of sudden warming or unexplained chemical spikes. They're scattered like puzzle pieces, fragments of a story that may never be whole again. And yet, the outline is there, the outline of a civilization before us. We often imagine that if a first civilization existed, the proof would be obvious. Skyscrapers in the jungle, metal machines buried in stone. But the truth is, time is merciless. Skyscrapers would crumble in centuries, machines would rust to dust, even plastic, so stubborn in our world, would be pulverized into invisible particles within a few million years. So the proof wouldn't look like monuments. It would look like whispers, isotopes in the rocks, buried anomalies, myths that refuse to die. And maybe that's exactly what we already have. The problem isn't that the evidence doesn't exist. The problem is that it doesn't look the way we expect. But imagine, for a moment, that the discovery came. A machine embedded in stone millions of years old. A library beneath the sea, an artifact no natural process could explain. What would happen then? History books would collapse. Religions would fracture. Nations would scramble to claim the legacy. Some would call it proof of gods, others proof of aliens, others proof that humanity's story is 1,000 times older than we ever believed. It would be the most disruptive discovery in human history, not just because it rewrites the past, but because it forces us to ask who we really are. Are we the inventors of civilization, or are we simply the survivors of it? And here lies the most chilling implication. If they rose and fell, so can we. The Earth has always been a dangerous home. Comets, volcanoes, floods, all remind us that nothing built here is permanent. But the real danger may not be the planet. It may be ourselves. Pride, greed, unchecked power. Atlantis fell for arrogance. Babel for ambition. Myths repeat the same lesson again and again. Civilizations don't just fall from without, they fall from within. If we are repeating the cycle, then maybe the first civilization's greatest gift wasn't knowledge but warning, a whisper across time. We made the same mistakes. Don't follow us. And yet here we are, altering the climate, building weapons that can erase millions, pushing our world to the brink. The parallels are almost too sharp to ignore. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that we might already be in the process of becoming myth ourselves. Imagine thousands of years from now. Our skyscrapers are gone, our satellites have fallen, our languages are forgotten. All that remains are fragments. A story of a great flood, a legend of gods in the sky, a ruin beneath the sea. Future peoples might look at those fragments and argue, just as we do now, was there really a civilization here, or is it just myth? In that sense, we may already be the first civilization for someone else. We are the story that will puzzle the future, the echo that refuses to fade. But maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's the only way civilizations survive, through echoes, fragments, and stories that outlast the ruins. If the first civilization lived, then we are its legacy, whether we know it or not. Its myths became our religions, its ruins became our mysteries, its warnings became our survival. And if we fall, then perhaps our own myths will become the seeds of the next. Maybe one day, thousands of years from now, new peoples will tell stories of gods who lived in towers that touched the clouds, who flew in fire chariots, who spoke through glowing boxes. They will remember us as something greater than we were, just as we remember those before us. Maybe that's the cycle. Not just rise and fall, but transformation, each civilization becoming the myth of the next. But here's the thing. Cycles aren't destiny. They're patterns, and patterns can be broken. If a first civilization fell because of pride, we don't have to. If it vanished because of disaster, we can prepare. If it collapsed because of war, we can choose peace. The echoes of the past don't have to be prophecies. They can be warnings. And warnings, if heard, can save us. So perhaps the real question isn't, did the first civilization exist? Perhaps the question is, what will we do if it did? Will we honour their memory by enduring where they fell? Or will we prove the cycle unbreakable, vanishing into myth just as they did? Maybe the first civilization did build the world we know. Maybe we're walking on their ruins, speaking their myths, repeating their mistakes. Or maybe it's all imagination. a story we've invented because we can't accept the fragility of our own world. Either way, the result is the same. The past is full of echoes, echoes of floods and fires, echoes of gods and warnings, echoes of civilizations rising, falling, and being forgotten. And now, we are part of that same echo. Because in the end, the haunting truth is this: the world we know may not be the beginning. It may not even be the middle. It may only be one brief note in a song the Earth has been singing for millions of years, a song of civilizations that rise, fall, and leave only whispers behind. The question is not whether they existed. The question is whether we will last long enough for someone else to ask the same question about us.